name is Janet Brown. I'm Executive Director of the Commission on Presidential Debates, and I'd like to welcome all of you here for what I know is going to be a very special evening and a very interesting discussion. We've got a distinguished audience in many respects, and I hope you will join me in welcoming one member of the audience, the Chief Executive of this state, Governor Joan Finney. The Commission on Presidential Debates is a nonprofit foundation based in Washington, and while you may not know it, you have been watching us in '88 and '92 when you turned on the presidential and vice presidential debates during the general election campaign. That is what we do. During midterm election years, we sponsor forums that are designed to engage people in the discussion of important public policy matters, and our particular emphasis is on getting young people involved in these discussions. The project that we're undertaking this year is a national tour of the 1992 debate set, which you are looking at. As you know, it was the only debate to include 3 presidential candidates. The invitation to come here to the University of Kansas, which we are very grateful for, came from a person who had a very central role in the fact that there are 3 debate podiums. That is Dr. Diana Carlin of the Speech Communication Department of this university. As a member of the Commission's advisory board for the last 7 years, she has been involved in virtually every single one of the critical issues that we have been engaged in, from the actual formats used during the debates to the very, very difficult decision of how to evaluate third-party candidacies. She has worked with Professor Richard Neustadt of Harvard since 1987 to develop the criteria that we use and apply each year, and which in '92 resulted in the invitation of Mr. Perot to join Mr. Clinton and Mr. Bush in the debates. We're deeply indebted to her for this invitation, to the university for being here. I would like to introduce Diana Carlin. She'll take it from here.
Thank you, Janet, and I want to second my thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful Sunday night to spend this time with us. I would like to introduce the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, David Schulenburger, who is here representing the Chancellor's office. If it hadn't been for the Chancellor's office, we would not have been able to have done this. Just the mere fact that the Union isn't usually open on Sunday night took a little bit of influence from high places to be able to do this here. I would also like at this time to introduce Dean James Muyskens, who is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to formally welcome you to the University of Kansas.
Thank you, Diana. On behalf of the staff, the faculty, and the administration of the university, I'm delighted to welcome you to this event this evening. It's a special honor as well for me to welcome to this university and to Lawrence, our distinguished panel, who will be debating a most timely and urgent topic. The primary purpose of a university is learning, and that learning is acquired in many ways, with conversation, debate, and dialogue being chief among them. For this reason, a university is a fitting setting for events such as this evening's debate. And through the give and take of the participants, we can all deepen our understanding, stretch our imaginations, and gain new insights. In short, we can all learn. It also seems to me appropriate that the debate is being held here on this campus. Its being here gives proper recognition of the work of Professor Diana Carlin, who, as you know, has worked hard on the Presidential Debates Commission. Also, I believe it is an appropriate way for us here to pay tribute to the KU debate program. Over the years, no other university has established a more impressive record of achievements in top-level intercollegiate debate. We're all justifiably proud of the debate team's accomplishments. We're also proud of those of its home department, the Department of Communication Studies, which is one of the sponsors of tonight's events. So, we have awaited this debate with great anticipation. We're honored to have it here at the University of Kansas. And on behalf of our university, I thank everyone who's had a part in the planning of this debate and all of its sponsors. And again, a warm welcome to all of you in the audience and to our panelists. Thank you.
This event would not have taken place if it hadn't been for many hours of effort by many individuals. As you probably noticed in the program, there was a coalition of sponsors who put this together, and I'd like to recognize several people who have been especially hardworking at bringing this event to reality. Let me begin with my colleague in the department, Scott Harris, the debate coach. Where is Scott? Oh, he's standing back there. He's going to watch the technical people back there. Scott was largely responsible for getting all the logistics taken care of tonight. I would also like to introduce the chairman of the Department of Communication Studies, Dr. Howard Sypher. One of the other sponsors tonight who has contributed a great deal of creativity is Kids Voting Kansas. Lawrence, as many of you know, is a kids voting community, and we have the president and CEO of Kids Voting Kansas, Melissa Masoner, in the audience. The fact that we have such a distinguished panel of individuals on the stage here tonight would not have happened if it hadn't been for the efforts of two individuals. Bill Koch from the Koch Crime Commission. Mr. Koch, if you would please stand. It was his idea to take what we had originally suggested, which was having students debate the Koch Crime Commission preliminary report, to having a panel of experts in so that everyone could question them about the issue of crime after listening to them. He was assisted by David Thoreau of the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, in helping to secure all of these individuals, and also contributed to underwriting a large part of the costs of this event tonight. The other individuals who we really need to thank are our other contributors who have helped make all of this possible, and they are listed in the program, and I would ask them to stand right now. I think they're here. Tom Schwartz, representing Famous Brands, Tom Beisecker, representing Advocacy Research Associates, and I don't think I've left anyone out. I hope not. Anyway, I appreciate all of the efforts and energy, and I'm going to now turn this over to Arthur Miller, professor of law at Harvard University, and someone who you probably all know from Miller's Court on PBS. Mr. Miller.
Good evening and welcome to the Union at Kansas University. I'm Arthur Miller of the Harvard Law School, and our resolution tonight is crime will continue to be a major social problem so long as the criminal justice system fails at punishment. And to debate that question, we have 6 nationally regarded experts in the field of crime and punishment. Taking the affirmative is William Barr.
I'm Bill Barr. I'm the former Attorney General of the United States.
First speaker taking the negative.
I'm Ray Kelly. I'm the former police commissioner of the city of New York.
Our second pro on the proposition.
I'm pleased to be called a pro. My name is Pasco Bowman. I'm a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. I live in Kansas City, Missouri.
Our second speaker for the negative is
Nadine Strassen, professor of constitutional law at New York Law School and president of the American Civil Liberties Union.
And our last speaker on the affirmative of the proposition.
I'm Bayless Tate. I'm president of the Board of Police Commissioners, Kansas City, Missouri.
And our final representative for the negative.
I'm Randy Barnett. I'm a professor at Boston University School of Law, and before being a professor of law, I was a criminal prosecutor in Chicago.
Then let us begin. General Barr. Is punishment appropriate in a civilized society? Aren't there better ways to improve the nation?
Punishment is necessary in all societies for those who deviate from the rules of society. In a healthy society, we rely on self-control to keep order, but all societies need another line of defense for people who can't control themselves. I think one of the problems we have in our society today is the problem of violent crime, which has gone up by 500% in the last 30 years and is spreading out into communities that haven't experienced the kind of violence that we're seeing today. Today we have young people being victimized at record levels, and minority citizens also victimized at record levels. Now, there's no one single solution to dealing with this, but one of the things we have to do, and I think one of the foundational steps we have to take, is to restore our criminal justice system and its credibility. Today, we see no punishment, no real punishment in the system. We have a revolving door where prisoners spend, on the average, 33% of their sentence in prison. So the average rapist only serves 4 years, and the average murderer only 8 years. And they're let right back out on the street to commit crimes again. 5 out of 8 released prisoners are rearrested within 3 years. 6,500 of our fellow citizens, that's 30% of the murders committed in this country, are committed by people on probation and parole. We have to stop this revolving door and inflict real punishment and real time on those violent predators and keep them off the street. That serves the deterrent function of a justice system. It also serves the incapacitating function, that is, separating the wrongdoer from society. It also serves the retributive function, seeing that people get their due. Today in our society, I think many citizens feel that the punishments are not severe enough for those who really victimize our citizens. Is 4 years really the price that we should be exacting for a violent rape? And finally, I don't think it's inconsistent with rehabilitation. In fact, we've tried all the early release programs to help rehabilitate people. It hasn't worked. And work in prison, drug treatment in prison, is just as effective at rehabilitating people and extending the hope that they will not return to prison ultimately.
I think anyone who says that we're not punishing people adequately in this country simply has to look at the statistics. Our prison population has increased fivefold. In the early 70s, we had 200,000 people incarcerated in this country. We now have 1.2 million people. And someone once told me the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting that things will change, and it simply won't. I would submit that I am certainly for punishment of people who commit crimes, but we're not going to see any significant changes in our malaise by simply increasing the punishment. I would submit that if the proposition said that crime will continue to be a significant social problem as long as there are increasing numbers of dysfunctional families, I would vote for it. I see that as the driving force behind crime in this country and a lot of other social problems that we have. Unwed mothers bringing forward unsupervised young people impact on the police of our cities every day, and it's increasing in number. It's now estimated that 1/3 of the births in America will be as a result of out-of-wedlock births. It simply is a problem that goes far beyond the scope of law enforcement. But indeed, it's the driving force behind crime in America, in my opinion.
I should indicate to the audience that these questions are being asked of the debaters spontaneously. They have not been given these questions, and that in each instance there will be a rebuttal from a member of the opposing team as selected by the group while the speaker before them is speaking. So what you are hearing is truly extemporaneous. Commissioner, what is wrong with a society wreaking vengeance on evil or warehousing criminals simply to make the streets safer?
Well, I think that's exactly the point, not making the streets safer. If you look at this increasing prison population in the last 25 years, at the same time you've had an increase in crime. Clearly, I don't think anyone feels safer now than they did 25 years ago when we started to, quote, warehouse prisoners. It's simply not the solution. It is handling a part of the symptoms, but it is clearly not something that is going to significantly impact. We're talking about making a change. We want to see the crime rates go down significantly. As Bill Barr said, violent crime is up 400% in the last 25 years. We want to reverse that trend. We haven't done it by increasing the prison population fivefold. I can tell you what's happening in my state. In New York, we went from 12,500 prisoners in 1970 to 65,000 now. And clearly, people feel certainly not any safer and a lot less safe than they did 25 or 30 years ago. I think we need to use the bully pulpit. I think we need community leaders to argue for family, for controlling or reducing greatly the out-of-wedlock birth rate. And I'm encouraged by the fact that President Clinton is about to initiate a $400 million campaign against illegitimacy. Now, we're not talking about the morality of it. I'm certainly not. I'm talking about the real-world issues that police have to face. Large numbers of unsupervised youth on the streets of our city. You superimpose the drug problem and the gun problem on this population, and you have the formula for mayhem.
And vengeance?
Vengeance, I guess, is part of the equation. But what is it accomplishing? Nothing is changing. Indeed, it's getting worse. Does vengeance fit into the equation? Sure. Retribution? Sure. That's part of it. Rehabilitation? We talk about rehabilitation. In my 30 years in law enforcement, I've seen very little rehabilitation. We talk about boot camps and things like that. They're all gimmicks and gadgets. We have no meaningful rehabilitation coming down the pike. I think we got to get back to basics and support the family structure.
Vengeance isn't the right word for it. Vengeance occurred before governments went to citizens and said, we'll protect you. Don't seek private revenge. We will go and find the right person and mete out the proper punishment. That's the basis of the social contract, physical security for the citizens. And governments, particularly nowadays, are not meeting its end of the bargain on this social contract. But I want to follow up on what Ray said. I don't disagree that the ultimate problem in our society has more to do with broken families and unsupervised kids. But whatever we can do on that front is going to take 20 years. People need protection today from the predators. And we have to create an environment of peace and security in our neighborhoods so that our efforts to rehabilitate neighborhoods and families can take hold. And we can't do that if we have a criminal justice system that criminals laugh at. We have to hold people accountable. And in our society, if criminals see they can get away with it and get right back out on the street, we're not going to teach people, including the young people, accountability and self-control.
Do you, as a proponent of the affirmative of this proposition, seriously contend that there is an equality in the punishment meted out to offenders in this country?
I can't speak for the state courts. I'm a federal judge. I suspect that here and there is inequality. In the federal system, we've tried to deal with that. Congress tried to deal with that in the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. And that legislation led to the famous or maybe infamous federal sentencing guidelines, which are not really guidelines. They are very particularized rules that once you figure out how they apply, these rules tell the judge what kind of punishment within a very narrow range the judge must give to this particular offender, to this particular offense. And the very idea was to eliminate to eliminate inequality in sentencing. The idea was that the same offense, the same circumstances, the same relevant conduct, which is a term of art under the guidelines, if performed in, say, Boston, will get you the same sentence that it would if performed in Kansas City. And it doesn't matter what judge sentences you, that judge is obligated to apply the guidelines and to mete out the punishment prescribed by the guidelines. Another aspect of the guidelines is truth in sentencing, because one of the other things the sentencing guidelines did, or I should say the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 did, was to eliminate parole for federal crimes. Any federal crime committed after November 1, 1987, that criminal is no longer eligible for parole. So the sentence imposed, the sentence you see, is the sentence the perpetrator gets. So these two things, equality of sentencing, hard time sentencing, truth in sentencing, these are the central features of the federal sentencing guidelines. Now, have the guidelines eliminated all inequalities? I can't say that they have, but at least they've eliminated, I believe, gross disparities in sentencing in the federal system of the kind that we were seeing before the guidelines came into effect, the kind of disparities that Congress was, I think, rightly concerned about.
The federal sentencing guidelines are a disaster. They have not eliminated the kind of sentencing disparity that they were hoped to eliminate. In fact, the vast consensus among federal judges themselves, those who actually have to work with these guidelines, is to be heavily critical. No less law and order and no less important a judge than Chief Justice Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court is among the many federal judges who has deplored these guidelines as building in a rigidity that does not result in either fairness or equality. Indeed, the United States Sentencing Commission itself recently did a study on the operation of the federal sentencing guidelines, and they found that they perpetuated rather than eliminated the most troubling and the most pervasive form of inequality in our criminal justice system, and that is racial discrimination. What these guidelines do is not remove discretion from the system. They simply transfer the discretion from the sentencing judge, where it appropriately belongs, to the prosecutor. And the study that was done by the Sentencing Commission, along with other similar studies, has shown that at the stage of determining whom to charge and what to charge with, that is where racial discrimination is creeping into our system. And that troubling fact is something that has been noted by the American Bar Association, by every serious study that's been done of the criminal justice system in the recent past, at every stage, from who is arrested, who is charged, what they are charged with, who is convicted, and how they are sentenced. Our system, from start to finish, treats people differently on the basis of their race, not only on the basis of their own race, but on the basis of the race of the victim. I think it is a very, very sad commentary that our prisons are filled with young African-American men, far out of disproportion to their population in our society and far out of proportion to the population of people who, for example, are drug abusers. A far higher percentage of African-American drug abusers are in our prisons than of white drug abusers. So looking at the most basic concept of equality, equality on the basis of race, is absolutely absent from our criminal justice system.
Then what procedures would you advocate to achieve a level of equality in sentencing?
One that would be very important, again, starting with the basic issue of race, is one positive feature, one of the few positive features of the crime bill that was adopted by the House. although this feature is absent from the Senate version of the bill. It is something that is called the Racial Justice Act, and all it would do would be to allow a defendant in certain cases, I believe certainly death penalty cases, to challenge that most severe of sentences on the basis of a racial disparity. If the defendant could show a pattern of racial disparity in terms of either the race of the perpetrator or the race of the victim, then that person would be allowed to challenge the penalty, much as we allow with respect to patterns of discrimination in housing or in employment. The United States Supreme Court, though, a few years ago rejected that kind of evidence as a basis for challenging death sentences. So this would be one very important tool for allowing protection of racial equality in the most draconian aspect of the criminal justice system and sentencing, namely death penalty sentences.
Well, as of now, there aren't many federal crimes that carry the death penalty, so I'm now not sure how far that provision would cut. To the extent that it would have any real application in the federal courts, I fear it might bring in an application of the death penalty by quotas, and I can't think of anything more racist than that. That sounds like a terrible idea. That is, to determine punishment not on the basis of the merits of the case and not on the basis of what the defendant actually did, but to decide whether someone is eligible for the death penalty or not on the basis of their race or the race of the victim. It strikes me as being a monstrous idea. Now, as to where the discretion lies in the criminal justice system, it seems to me that under any system, the discretion of who to charge and what to charge and how much to charge always lies with the prosecutor. The judges never have and never will, under any rational system, have control over that. So sure, federal prosecutors have a lot of discretion as to what to charge. But under the guidelines, sentencing judges don't just look at the crime of conviction or necessarily even what's charged. You look at all the relevant conduct, and all the relevant conduct gets considered at sentencing. Now, to the extent that a deal is made between a defendant and a prosecutor to hide some of the relevant conduct, there's not much that judges ever have been able to do about that or can do about it now, but a defendant can hardly complain about that. It's absolutely true that a lot of federal judges, especially district judges, the judges who do the sentences, don't like the sentencing guidelines. First of all, it curtails their discretion to give whatever sentence they feel like giving. Now, I don't mean that to be a cynical statement, but before we had the guidelines, you might have a crime, and the statute says the range of punishment for this crime is 15 years to life. And the judge can look at the defendant and look at the crime and, pick a sentence anywhere within that vast range. And so you may have, say, a bank robber in Kansas City getting 50 years for a bank robbery, and the identically situated bank robber in, say, Boston, just to pick on my friend Randy, since he's from Boston, getting a minimum sentence. Now, what kind of fairness in sentencing is that? And that's the kind of unfairness and disparity and inequality that the sentencing guidelines were designed to do away with, and I think to a great measure have eliminated. Now, it's true the courts, federal courts, state courts, are awash in drug cases. And for better or for worse, Congress, not the courts, Congress has drawn up very, very strict penalties applicable to crack cocaine. Where is the problem of crack cocaine most acute? It's in the urban centers. And it's not exclusively, but it's largely a problem of minorities living in the urban centers, and that's where the enforcement efforts are concentrated. So naturally, this brings up into the net a lot of young black males who are engaged in crack cocaine transactions. And the punishment is draconian. And again, this comes from Congress. A given quantity of crack, it works on a 100-to-1 ratio, so that you translate the amount of cocaine, of crack cocaine into the quantity of real cocaine and multiply by 100. And that becomes the quantity that's used for sentencing purposes. So you get some really, really long sentences in crack cocaine cases. Maybe they're too draconian. That's a problem to be addressed to the legislature. It's not a problem that the courts can do anything about, because in the final analysis, as long as what Congress tells us to do is constitutional, we have a constitutional obligation to apply the laws that Congress gives us, and that's what we do. But I'm not nearly so skeptical about the efficacy or the fairness of the sentencing guidelines as Nadine is.
You both have referred to the death penalty, both you and Nadine. Do you believe that the death penalty has a deterrent effect?
I don't know. I'm not sure that anyone really knows. This is the problem with knowing the extent to which any criminal law and any punishment deters crime. And that's because we don't see the crimes that are not committed. We can't count the crimes that are not committed because somebody said, gee, I better hadn't do that because it's against the law, or because it carries a real stiff jail term, or because it's a death penalty crime. We really don't know. The legislative presumption has been that punishments do deter crime. And we take that as an article of faith, or maybe even as an article of common sense if we apply it to our own life experiences. But honestly, does anybody really know? And I think ultimately the legislature has to go by its instincts and do what it thinks is best for its people in that regard.
As long as we don't know, and in fact, there have been no studies that have ever demonstrated the fact that the death penalty is a deterrent. Now, when I say is the death penalty deterrent, it's important to have the right question before us. It's not whether the death penalty, taken in the abstract, is a deterrent. The question is, does the death penalty deter criminals who are not deterred by the threat of lifetime imprisonment without parole? Does it add deterrence to the deterrence that's already achieved by lifetime imprisonment without parole? And no studies have ever shown, and these are studies that have been done cross-time between states that have not had the death penalty and then states that have had the death penalty, or across space, states that have the death penalty sitting next to states that do not have the death penalty. No studies have ever been conducted that have demonstrated that the death penalty adds a deterrence to what would otherwise be achieved by the threat of lifetime imprisonment without parole. So if that is the state of the evidence, and that has been stated by the Supreme Court of the United States to be the state of the evidence, then the question is, does the government have a rational justification to take people and put them to death in a premeditated fashion, as premeditated as any murder that has ever been committed by a private person against another? That is the question that you have to ask. Where is the rational justification? And it is not an answer to that question to say, we'll let the legislature decide, because we have to ask, do they have a rational basis for the decision that they have made? Now, the question, if in fact the death penalty has not been shown to be a deterrent, you have to also take into account the singular fact that is usually left out of this discussion, and that is the effect it has on the innocent accused. It is a tragedy if someone is imprisoned falsely who is not guilty. And as a former prosecutor, I would like to think that everybody that I prosecuted was actually guilty. And I believed everybody I prosecuted to be guilty at the time I prosecuted them. And it would have been a tragedy if anybody that I was responsible for sending to the penitentiary was actually not guilty. But it would be a tragedy that would be to some extent reversible by releasing that person if the truth is afterwards discovered. When you put a person to death, you can never undo that. The state has now killed somebody, and that person cannot be brought back. And I guess the final thing I would say, and this is something about which I think reasonable people might differ, but I do think that in the very cases when the death penalty seems to be the most invoked and the most needed to be invoked, those are the very cases in which we are likely to see a rush to judgment by the police because they are very high publicity cases where a tremendous amount of pressure is being placed on the police to find the criminal, to find the offender, and they may latch on to the most natural person that comes to their minds in the first instance without pursuing it. And so I think there is a good deal of doubt as to whether the very cases in which the death penalty would be utilized are the ones when you're more likely to have innocent people convicted than other cases.
Yet one of the objections to the administration of criminal justice in this country, particularly with regard to the death penalty, is that it is much too slow to be effective, which suggests that we are very, very, very careful before we administer the death penalty. And why does that not suggest that we administer it reasonably wisely?
Well, I believe we probably do administer it reasonably wisely, but then again, this brings forth the objection that you can't expect the death penalty to deter someone if it takes 10 years for it to be implemented. So you can't have it both ways. You can't both insist that the death penalty, a swift, sure punishment that a criminal is going to believe that he or she may get when they contemplate committing a crime. You can't have that and at the same time have the protections a civilized society needs to protect the innocent, those among us who may be falsely accused of a crime. I think that one of the lessons that you draw out of experience in the criminal justice system is that, in fact, the criminal justice system, which generally I think does get it right, and if this were a debate on a different topic, I might be arguing the pro-prosecution side on this issue, generally does get it right, makes mistakes, and it's because it's a fallible human institution driven by passions and ignorance like every other institution. Was that my question?
Yes.
Okay.
As far as being an advocate for the death penalty, I don't know that I can play that role. But certainly I feel that you can be an advocate for punishment for criminals without favoring the death penalty. I feel that one of the problems, if you're going to use the death penalty, is the long period of time. I mean, there's no relationship now between the actual sentencing and the actual execution of the penalty. Certainly, I heard my compatriots speak to the death penalty not being a deterrent. I've seen and heard of many criminals that have been given the death penalty appealing for a life sentence. I've heard very few that have been given a life sentence appealing for the death penalty. Thank you.
If you believe that punishment is at least in part designed to deter, should the public be permitted to witness the punishment?
He told you these questions were spontaneous, didn't he? I believe that I don't believe that it should be made a media event. I really don't, but I guess I have much more compassion for the victims than for the criminals themselves, and I believe that the victims should be allowed the opportunity to view the punishment.
Do you think the victims should have the opportunity?
The victims and their families, yes.
To provide input into the question of punishment?
Absolutely, absolutely, into the question of punishment and any type of release. They should also have total review and approval.
Approval?
Right, approval.
Is that a pleasant way of saying a veto power?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad we have reached the issue of the victim of crime, because that seems to be the person who is always left out of discussions of what should be done with criminals. And in fact, in our criminal justice system, I think we've placed far too much emphasis on the criminal and far too little emphasis on justice. And by justice, I mean justice to victims. That is, having criminals do something that would actually provide a benefit to victims, making restitution to victims. What we need, I believe, to appropriately address the issue of justice as opposed to the issue of deterrence and crime prevention is to, in a sense, harness a couple of different movements that have taken place in the last 15 or 20 years in criminal justice thinking. The first is the victims' rights movement, which attempts to get victims involved in the criminal justice system. But this is the tail wagging the dog in the current criminal justice system. When I was a prosecutor prosecuting rape cases, every case I prosecuted was the people of the state of Illinois against so-and-so. It was not a victim against so-and-so. The victim in every criminal prosecution in this country is a witness to a crime that has been committed against the people of the state in which that crime took place, or the Commonwealth of that state, or the state itself. That is, the victim is not a party to a criminal action. And I think that's shockingly, horrifyingly wrong. And for that reason, because that is the engine that drives the criminal justice system, victims will always be an appendage to our criminal justice system as long as its preoccupation is with the state punishing criminals, rather than having the preoccupation be forcing criminals to pay back victims. Now, how, you say, is that possible? It's certainly not possible in every case, and I'm not arguing that it's a panacea for anything. But what I'm suggesting is that we have experience with employment of prisoners in every state in this country. We have women who sew jeans in Oregon. We have women who answer the Best Western 800 telephone reservation line in Arizona. We have men who are rehabbing houses in Washington, D.C., and building prefab homes in Oregon. In other words, we have experience putting criminals to work. These are hardened criminals to work. But we don't have the will in a system that's preoccupied with punishment. The objections are constantly made. This is too easy for them. This is something, you're displacing honest workers by having criminals work in this way. And yet that's got to be the first step towards putting criminals in a position where they can pay back their victims rather than simply being warehoused at the public's expense.
Professor, obliquely you've referred to rehabilitation and restitution. Are those two possible alternatives to harder punishment politically feasible in a nation that does not want to be soft on crime?
Well, I think any rehabilitation that should occur in a criminal justice system should be incidental to doing justice, just as any punishment that should occur in a criminal justice system should be incidental to doing justice. So the debate we have to have in this country, and I think it's a debate we need to have, and it's a debate that we haven't had, is what is justice in this country? What is justice? What is criminal justice? What should our justice system be doing? As justice, not as deterrence, but as justice. And I think we can then have a debate about whether punishing people because they're bad is what the state should be doing, or forcing them to do justice to their victims is what the state should primarily be doing. And also, I should add, just in the interest of completeness, segregating dangerous, demonstrably dangerous people from the community into facilities where they can't commit crimes against anyone other than criminals, other convicts. So that is a separate issue. But with respect to restitution, I think it's an issue that we don't address in this country because we are committed to the punishment paradigm. And I would like to see this debate begin that debate.
I think our system of justice should attempt to accomplish a number of different objectives, and one of them is retributive justice, that someone who breaks the rules and inflicts injury on someone else in society, takes their life, or what have you, that they get meted out against them the appropriate punishment. That's retributive justice. I also think it's part of the state's function to deter crime by ensuring that's done, separating the violent criminal from society, incapacitating them. The typical violent offender, repeat offender, commits 15 crimes, serious crimes, a year when they're out on the street. when they're in prison, those crimes are not being committed. And finally, rehabilitation. But rehabilitation does not necessarily mean early release back out into the community. I think part of rehabilitation should be work, and there I fully agree with Randy. In fact, one of the things, to the extent that we're able to turn people around in prison, it's largely through work programs, and those work programs allow prisoners to pay restitution and also to offset the cost of incarceration.
To what extent are alternatives to punishment as we now administer it, namely prison, such as electronic monitoring of people on release programs or boot camps or intensively supervised programs outside prison, effective?
The first thing to remember is that we already put an emphasis on alternatives to prison. 3 out of every 4 convicted defendants are outside the system. Only a quarter are inside the system in prison. So we already have community supervision and other kinds of discipline or punishment that are in the community outside of prison. That's 3/4 of the criminal defendants. Now, I believe that those are important tools, especially for nonviolent offenders, so we don't tie up prison space, very valuable prison space, with people that do not pose a threat to the community, a threat of violence. And so I'm for electronic monitoring, supervised work programs in the community, rehabilitating houses, cleaning up the community and so forth for nonviolent offenders. But I think we have to adopt an attitude of zero tolerance for violence in this society. And people have to know that if they commit a crime of violence, they are going to prison for a significant period of time.
It's interesting. One could ask, how effective is incarceration, or how much more effective is it than some alternative sentence? I find it kind of contradictory that Bill Barr says, on the one hand, we incarcerate all these people, and then we see them go out and commit more crimes, and then they're recidivists, and we incarcerate them again, and they go out and they commit more crimes. Doesn't sound to me as if that's a very persuasive argument for the effectiveness of incarceration, if what we're trying to do is stop people from committing crimes. In fact, this society does clearly overutilize incarceration and has not even explored seriously the feasibility of alternatives. And I'm not talking just as a civil libertarian who is looking at alternatives that are less punitive, less restrictive on the freedom of the criminal. I am also looking for alternatives that will be more effective in terms of preventing crime, in terms of protecting the safety of society. Given the so-called war on drugs we have, with its mandatory minimum sentences, even for first-time, nonviolent drug users, we are now finding that more than 50% of all people newly entering prisons at both the federal and the state level are there for nonviolent offenses. We also know that when they get into prison, virtually none of them get drug treatment, and virtually all of them have access to drugs. And we are paying at least $25,000 per year per inmate for them to get their supply of drugs in prison. Is that effective? Can we not think of a more cost-effective alternative, such as supervised drug treatment in the community?
You use the word alternative several times without specifying any. What alternatives have a proven track record?
I hesitate to say there is a proven track record, Arthur, for the very reason I alluded to in my initial answer, that this society has so depended on incarceration that we only have a track record with respect to that. And I think we all agree it is an abysmal track record. Prisons are a school for crime. They breed recidivism, and although our incarceration rate has trebled just in the last 10 years, people do not feel safer. I think it is time for us to seriously look at alternatives. And let me just mention one example which has not been used, and that is intense probation or intensely supervised probation. Now, when people are on probation or on parole, they have virtually no supervision at all. We have caseworkers who have hundreds of cases and cannot keep any meaningful control or supervision over the probationers. Many criminal justice experts are now advocating a form of intensely supervised probation. It would be much more expensive because there would be much smaller caseloads per officer, but it would be much less expensive than incarceration, and I think it is an alternative that we should seriously investigate.
Thank you. We will now switch to the next phase of this debate, and I invite 4 panelists to join us here on the podium. Each of these panelists will be permitted to question any of the debaters they wish for a period of 5 minutes each. I ask the first panelist to introduce herself.
My name is Amy Terrell, and I represent Piper and Kids Voting Kansas.
Our second panelist.
Good evening. My name is Todd Stramel. I represent the Commission on Presidential Debates.
My name is Bill Koch. I represent the Koch Crime Commission.
My name is Robert Vaughn. I represent the Black Student Union and the University of Kansas.
You now have 5 minutes to question our panelists.
I've heard the panelists tonight speak mainly about punishment, and this is a question more about prevention. My question is directed towards Mr. Bayless Tate. Earlier this evening, I heard you mention that educational institutions should be restricted to enhancing learning and that moral character should be taught in the home. And I was wondering, how can you teach people that are children that are homeless or who live with friends or who don't have parents? And also, I would like to know, how are these morals going to be consistent across the nation?
Just to very briefly clarify, I didn't say that moral character, the teaching of morals should be restricted. Basically, what I said about teaching and teachers is that their main job should be developing the minds, not restricted solely to that. But you were correct, and I believe that the development of moral character is the job of the parents. When parents themselves have no moral character, or when we're with individuals that are homeless of that sort, you have to start with some of the initiatives like we started in Kansas City, Missouri now, with a group called the Kauffman Foundation and with our Jackson County drug tax. We are introducing from a community and from a grassroots level programs and activities that envelop such things as mentors for these children, and people becoming involved in communities and taking their communities back and involved in all directed towards the children, because that's where the answer is. It's with the children, and that's the direction that we're going. And some of the initiatives that are catching national exposure now. One, the mentoring program, where we've made a commitment in Kansas City that there will be at least one mentor for every 40 children in the city. I mean, that type of a comprehensive program. Our Project Neighborhood is taking back the neighborhoods and getting all facets of the neighborhoods involved. But it's not going to be done, I mean, you can't just sit back and say, parents, you're going to have to be held accountable. We as an entire community are going to have to take our communities back. And if parents can't be accountable, then we're going to have to be accountable for their children. We're going to have to be accountable for our children, for our nieces, for our nephews, for our grandchildren. We all have to accept an additional degree of accountability if we're going to be safe in our neighborhoods again.
Okay, and how do you assure that each child is learning the same values of what's right and what's wrong, that these values are consistent?
I don't know that we will ever be able to ensure that each child in this country is taught the same values. I mean, that's, if I could solve that equation, I wouldn't be here this evening. But I mean, to ensure across this nation that each child in each home is taught the same values, that in itself would be mind-boggling. The only way you might be able to do it is to get control of your media again and start, since so many parents feel now that television should raise their children and they sit them there in front of them for up to 6 hours a day. If we were to maybe evolve back to some constructive, really enlightening television, that may be one way, but I don't know if there's ever any way we'll be able to ensure across this country. We never have been in our entire history, and I don't see that being anything that's going to happen in the near future, but we can do better.
Okay, one more question. Does anyone think that perhaps these moral character values should be implemented in schools instead of in the home? Do any of the panelists think that?
I think they should be fortified or supported, but they have to come from the home. That's my opinion.
I'm looking at two academics over here, neither of whom seem to believe that schools should be a moral force.
I was just going to say,
Judge?
Say one quick thing. It's true we'll never get everybody on exactly the same page of the great book of morality, and maybe we wouldn't want to do that. But I think there are just 2 or 3 basic precepts that ideally we would want every person, every child, every adult, everybody to know and practice. I would include in that list respect for civility, respect for authority, and most of all, respect for other human beings and their rights, and the idea that other people aren't just objects that you can do anything to or with you want to do, but they're other human beings just like you, with feelings, with aspirations, with interests, and with rights, and those other human beings need to be respected. And I think if that is inculcated, we would eventually have far less crime, because it seems to me that every crime that is committed is, at its root, a spiritual failure. It's a breakdown of that person's internal control mechanisms. That person has lost his or her compass or value system or whatever it is that creates that little voice that tells us, don't do that. It's wrong. And I think there are a few basic things that we would hope would be taught in every home and in every school that would help to inculcate and reinforce those very important values.
Of certain issues that brings this panel together, about which we are, and brings this audience together, and about which we are all concerned in common. And I think, in a sense, to distract us over to issues of other things, other ways of living life, whether you should live life by going to school, or whether you should live life by driving a truck, or whether you should live life by sort of just hanging out and having a good time, or going surfing, or whatever it is people do. I think that distracts us, in a sense, from the issues that we do have in common, which is a concern for injustice perpetrated by one person against another person.
Mr. Koch.
I have a question for Bill Barr, the first one. That is that studies have shown that when a young male reaches the age of 19, it's too late to do anything with him. He's gone. And yet 90% or 80% of the Justice Department resources are all spent on adults. Studies have also shown that after 3 arrests, whether it's a juvenile or not, there's an 83% chance that that person will become a habitual criminal. Do you think that juveniles should be treated as adults?
Well, first, the reason that the Justice Department's resources don't go to juveniles is because the Justice Department, the federal Justice Department, has limited jurisdiction. The federal government cannot handle all local street crime, and so it has very select areas, none of which really touch on juveniles. So that's an allocation of responsibility between the federal government and the state government. But getting to the broader question of how to deal with juveniles, the studies show most young people who get into trouble are salvageable and can be straightened out if their attention is grabbed early. But studies show that after 3 offenses, there's virtual 100% recidivism. That young person has embarked on a career of crime, and we all know it because we all see that most violence, predatory violence in our society, is committed by people with rap sheets, very long rap sheets, who usually got into trouble when they were early and no one intervened to do anything about it. I think we're not doing our young people any favors by counseling them and treating them gently for the first few offenses. In fact, what we're doing is we've become a conveyor belt for career criminals. And I think what we really have to adopt in the juvenile justice system is a system, to use the cliche, tough love. First offense, you have to show that that person will be held accountable. I'm not saying you throw them in prison and throw the key away, by no means. But they have to pay a price. They have to work for a while in a work camp or in a community project under supervision, something that's uncomfortable for them to do, that maybe has them pay restitution, but not just sit there, be counseled, and go back out again. And then the second element of our juvenile justice system is that once a juvenile demonstrates they're on a career of crime and is a repeat offender, committing ever increasingly serious offenses, that's the time where the interests of society have to become paramount over that of the child, who's only chronologically a child, but in fact a predator. And at that point, the juvenile should be treated as an adult in the criminal justice system.
I have a question for Randy. Randy, a drug dealer generally gets the same sentence as a rapist, and yet white-collar criminals only get community service. Do you think that's fair and moral?
Which is the thrust of your question? What happens to white-collar criminals, or what happens to drug offenders?
Well, both. I ask you a double question for a reason.
I clearly think it is wrong to punish drug offenders the way we punish drug offenders today. We do two things wrong in the criminal justice. We do many things wrong, but two things that we primarily do wrong is we attempt to punish rather than do other kinds of things. And punishment is like Gresham's law of currency. Punishment drives out any other alternative. Once you're preoccupied with punishment, you can't do anything else. But the other thing is we try to throw the mantle of criminal prosecutions on a much too wide a scope of human activity. We try to send tough messages about this, that, or the other sort of activity, saying you shouldn't do this, it's bad for you, we're going to make it a crime. In other words, we inflate the amount of crimes, and with the inflation comes a reduction in the value associated with the commission of any given crime. In other words, you can't have multiplying crime after crime after crime and still have crime mean the same thing. So in that sense, I would say that's wrong. To equate committing a drug offense with committing a rape is to do an injustice in both directions. It's an injustice to the person who has committed the so-called drug offense, and is also an injustice to a rape victim to say that what happened to her is on a par with what this other conduct was. And by the same token, with respect to the white-collar criminals, once again, if you're concerned with punishment, it's very easy to say, oh, well, just the sanction, just the convicting this person, that's punishment enough because of all the things that they're deprived of. Look where they're coming from. Look how hard it's going to hit them. If you're preoccupied with punishment as opposed to restitution, and in fact, I would say the one area in this country where we have made substantial progress is enforcing white-collar criminals to make restitution where possible. That seems to be something about which we actually have made some progress.
One last question to any panelist who would like to answer it. Is there any scientific evidence that any of the deterrents of punishment actually work?
Notice the mass movement to the microphone. The question is there any scientific evidence that any punishment acts as a deterrent?
Absolutely. There has never been a second murder committed by a murderer that was hung.
That's not deterrence. And in fact, there is clearly a lack of correlation between the administration of the death penalty, including hanging and deterrence. It's well known that when there were public hangings, the number of crimes that were taking place right at the hanging increased. And if you look at states that do have the death penalty, that are right bordering states that do not have the death penalty, there is no correlation between an increased homicide rate in the state with the death penalty. In fact, the opposite is true. In fact, if you look at states where you have the death penalty and you compare them to states that do not, there's not even any decrease in crimes that were committed by people in prison. So there is absolutely no evidence that the death penalty deters.
I just want to say, I think there's ample evidence that deterrence works for many people. All of us have driven down the highway and worried, well, should I go 75 miles an hour? You know the thought that goes through your head. Anyone who's filled out their taxes knows the thoughts that go through their head about a system of punishments. And it doesn't work for everybody, but it works for some. And if we can protect some victims, people in this society from being victimized through deterrence, then it's worth it.
I should note that although the mantle of criminality has been spread far and wide, it does not extend to demonstrations of approval or disapproval by the audience. Mr. Vaughn.
Yes, my question is directed towards the affirmative side. And as a concerned African American, my concern deals with the disproportion of, we can say, killings or lynchings or executions of young African American males. And that it seems to me that it would be cheaper to educate a youth or child than it would be to imprison him for life. And I would like to know, I mean, there seems like there's this big feeling on the affirmative side about the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Why don't we go back to, or why don't we adopt the caning or some type of, I mean, it seems, my question is that if this strong eye for eye, tooth for tooth is instilled and embedded in you, then why don't we go to caning or cutting off hands for stealing? That is my question.
Well, I suppose one reason we don't go to caning or cutting off hands, it sort of cuts against the grain of the kind of people we are, at least that we like to think we are. Also, there's perhaps a more practical reason. I think, and this has been observed throughout history, that if you make the punishment too awful or too severe or too apparently disproportionate to the crime, juries won't convict. And so you'll get a lot of juries convicting people who are really innocent because the jurors don't want to see this young person or whoever it is have his hand cut off, or they don't want him to get 12 strokes with the cane. So we have to have reasonable punishments. But at the same time, I think that the punishments we do have that are imposed, if we're going to have confidence in our criminal justice system, the punishments have to satisfy our collective sense of justice. And I'm not sure that letting a rapist just pay a little piddly compensation to the victim is going to satisfy the rape victim's sense of justice or anybody's sense of justice. If I were a rape victim, I wouldn't want this guy showing up on my doorstep once a week for the next 20 years to hand me a $10 check. I wouldn't like that. I'd want justice, which means I want him to go to jail. I want him to be there for a long time. I want him to be punished. What I'm saying by way of perhaps a rather crude illustration is that there is something in every human being that cries out for justice. And when we talk about the commission of awful crimes, that requires just punishment for the individual. And rehabilitation is great if we can achieve it. Compensation for the victim is great if we can achieve it. But that's not all there is to justice. One component of justice is, I believe, appropriate punishment.
Just to add on that question, I suppose, is as civilized as we say that the lethal injection should be or is, this is one of the methods that was adopted by Hitler in the Jewish prison concentration camps. And I don't know if there's any way you could justify death by electrocution, death by lethal injection, or death by the lynching or hanging. And I think that should be addressed as well.
The mechanics of how a restitution system can work are unfortunately too complicated to spend time on in a debate, to fully exhaust in a debate. I assure you, no one proposes it works the way Judge Bowman just suggested it should work, and that is that a rapist should show up at a rape victim's house on a weekly basis and offer a pittance of a compensation.
I was speaking metaphorically, Randy.
Right, but I mean, in fact, just so the audience is aware, the proposals that have been seriously offered is that, in fact, a substantial amount of money of the sort that you would see in a civil tort suit be awarded. And then the objection usually is that how could a person possibly spend the rest of their life working and earn enough money to pay off a rape victim? In other words, the problem with implementing restitution is actually how are you going to turn a rape sentence into anything other than a life imprisonment sentence in terms of what it would actually take to pay off such a sentence. And I think that's a serious problem, but it's a problem in the other direction. I think at some point in our discussion of punishment and incarceration, somebody must tell the truth about what incarceration is like in this country. Somebody must say that incarceration in this country consists of a combination of overpunishment, systematic overpunishment, and systematic underpunishment. The people that are overpunished are any first offenders, any nonviolent offenders, anybody who's about my height and weight and build. Anyone who is like me, who is sent to a penitentiary in this country, will be raped within a short period of time, and would in fact, in a sense, be made to, in a sense, be a slave of other inmates within a short period of time. And most sentencing judges in this country are aware of this fact, and it's the reason why they're reluctant to send first offenders to the penitentiary. This is the truth about it. And not only do you see same-sex rape pervasive in this country, but you see the diseases that are associated with that sort of activity pervasive. Something like a 600% increase in AIDS amongst the prison population over a 3-year period between 1988 and 1990 occurred in this country. And this is something that no one was sentenced to when they were sentenced to the penitentiary.
Mr. Vaughn, you have another question?
I just have to say one thing about underpunishment. The people we underpunishment are the gang members we send to the penitentiaries, where the penitentiaries are run by the very gangs on the street that those gang members were a member of, and those people are not punished by the penitentiary system.
My last question is to all the panelists. We talked about the 3 R's: restitution, reparation, and rehabilitation. Should we eliminate the books and some of the physical equipment that prisoners have in prison that helps them rehabilitate themselves? Should we eliminate that out of fear of them coming out to be stronger in society? That is the question.
I think this is an issue that surfaced, at least in New York, as far as boot camps are concerned, because there's a whole school of thought that says, first of all, there's no indication that the recidivist rate has gone down at all with boot camp training, and what you're doing is turning out some young men who are stronger, who are tougher, and are actually in prison for a shorter period of time, because that's the quid pro quo for boot camp. If you volunteer to go to boot camp, and it is a voluntary program. There's now legislation in several states in this country to do precisely what you're talking about, taking the physical equipment away. Now, easy to say that, but if you are in charge of a prison, as some of our Commission members have been, you have this population of some very difficult people to control. It is a means of instilling a certain amount of control. Recreational equipment. I would say that it has to be seriously thought of. And again, if you look at this boot camp proposal that's being put forward, that's in the crime bill, people look at that and couch it in terms of being some sort of panacea. It is not. There is no reduction in recidivism, and I think we should seriously look at taking out a lot of this physical equipment. You're building up people who then take out their rage and pent-up feelings on other prisoners.
We've now concluded the second portion of the program, and it is time for our town meeting. That's the portion of the program in which you, the audience, can participate. But before we can do that, we have to reset the stage. So if you will bear with us for a couple of minutes, we'll do that, and I'll come down and explain the rules of the town meeting to you.